Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us at our first Fiber Talk webinar organized by FTTH Council Asia Pacific. This is our first initiative of the webinar, the digital platform during the pandemic situation. As everyone knows that we're in a bad time. So thanks for joining us in this tough time. I believe everyone is in good health and situation. So we will start our webinar today. So let me go through the agenda for today. So we have with us our speaker, the first speaker, Guven Togan, who is the Vice Chair for our Smart Cities Committee of FTTH Council Asia Pacific, and also joined by Michael Finch, who is the head of Wire and Cable from CRU. So this is our agenda for today. At the beginning, we are already having our introductions and welcome session. And next session, we will move to the session by Guven Togan. The session's topic will be very timely considering the pandemic situation. The topic will be contactless installation for customer premises during pandemic. It will be done by Guven. And we will next have our second speaker, Michael Finch from CRU, and his topic will be current fiber optics market update with forecast by Michael Finch, of course. So after that, we will have a combined Q&A session. So the attendees, you are welcome to send us questions through the digital platform. You will find a tab on the screen for Q&A session. You can send us the questions during the Q&A session. So I think we can start now. We will start by our first speaker, Guven Togan. His presentation will be here shortly.
Sorry. No. Waiting my presentation, right?
Yes, so I welcome Guven Togan for his presentation, our first speaker for today's webinar. Please welcome Guven.
Thank you, Risafi. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon to everybody. I hope everybody is safe and healthy. I have only 10 minutes. I have a couple of page slides with me. Then after that, around 4 minutes video. Before the video, let's go through the slides. And it's not company introduction, but mostly we will focus one of our business, which is customer premise, the installation. Rusafi, is the control with me now?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Okay. I'm sure some of you already know me and already know about the PCOM. Just let me to tell you a few words about us. We are the Malaysian private company, 20 years old, and we are providing the integrated smart solution and services. And one of our service is high-speed broadband customer premise installation. Based on the number of the team, working area, the nationwide establishment, I can say we are the largest contractor in Malaysia for that. For many years already, we are a member of the FTTH Council APAC, and I believe our company and myself is one of the quite active members, right, Usafi, in the APAC. And the PICOM is the member of the Smart City Alliance in Malaysia, and we are the member of the 5G Task Force Group, is organized by the Malaysian regulator MCMC. There is some the photo about our customer premise installation team, vehicle, their material arrangement in the vehicle, and some photos. I can say proudly, I can say the PICOM successfully delivered more than 1 million customer premise installation in Malaysia. Actually, we achieved that number is last year. I believe the number this year is more than that now. Nationwide, we have 260 teams and some more teams under the internal training and on-job training. There is some photo how we are training the installer before send them to site. The internal training, hands-on theory trainings. Then we developed our own the tools and on digital platform to monitor the team work on the field when the real-time base, order management and inventory management. Thanks to this system, we allowed our installer directly travel to the customer premise from their home without stopping in our office or the site office to save the time and do more installation. But when the pandemic started, we already changed the rules, and later in the video and the next page I will explain. This is our customer premise installation flow chart, how we are arranging the material, how we are coordinating with the service provider for the customer premise equipments. And in this chart, all the yellow box is the PICOM's job scope. The rest is the service provider job scope. The CP management, nationwide material purchasing, supply install base is the PICOM is handling. But when you look to the left side, but before left side, this blue box is representing the digital platform by the service provider and for the PICOM to handle the orders and manage the material and the payments as well. Before the pandemic start, the service provider was receiving the customer application. Then after that, they were checking the coverage area confirmation, which is home pass availability or port availability. Then arranging the installation date, making the customer appointment, issuing the work order, and hand over that work order to PICOM. Then we were distributing the team through our digital platform. Then team traveling the customer premise directly, do the installation, do the testing, hand over, and update the system. But when the pandemic started, everybody was staying at home. I believe every country implemented either lockdown or the movement control order, like Malaysia, we call MCO. Almost more than 50 days we were at home, and everybody started to use broadband. And I believe the broadband traffic increased every country minimum 50%. And there was the high demand for the broadband as well. But due to safety issues, a lot of telcos stopped for the new installation service to the customers. After each government all the lockdown condition, and we noticed that some customer is not so comfortable to accept the installer to enter their home due to the scare of the virus that can transfer from them. Then we started March. We create the new SOP. We changed our current SOP, and we call this one is contactless installation. We prepare ourselves in March, and almost 1 month we are implementing that. And let me show you what changed after the pandemic start. On the service provider side, when the customer application receive, other than the checking only for the coverage area or home pass availability, the service provider is checking the safe zone confirmation. I don't know in other countries, but in Malaysia, the Minister of Health is issuing daily the red zone, green zone, yellow zone, based on the number of the daily case and active case. Some area we can work, some area we cannot work. Based on that one, service provider is deciding whether order will go ahead, service installation will go ahead or not. Then the customer appointment, there is a new things now. The service provider is asking the customer for their health confirmation, whether they are showing any symptom or they visited the risky area last 14 days or not. If everything is okay, then they are issuing the work order. Just now I mentioned our team was traveling to the customer premise directly before the pandemic. But during this time, we changed it and we are making daily roll call. Daily roll call means in the video you will see the area supervisor is checking every team whether team members is fit to work that day or not, and checking their health status and checking their body temperature and issuing the daily health declaration form for each installer. That's why every installer is attending the daily roll call first before they go to the customer premise. Then when they arrive the customer premise, contactless installation will start. Before the video, let me tell you what we changed for this contactless installation. The daily health declaration, first we start to issue the hard copy, but recently is digital copy for installer to show to the customer before they enter the customer premise. Then installer is using the new hygienic PPE, the personal protective equipment, which is mask, glove, hand sanitizer, and the wet tissue. And all is one-time use, disposable one. Then after each installation, the installer is changing all this PPE. Means that, let's say, if 3 installation per day, 3 set of the PPE to use. 4 installation, 4 set of the PPE to use. Then, before we enter to the customer premise, we are informing the customer to keep the safe distance always. And we are requesting other family members not to be in the working area. So then, before or during the short survey, to make the decision where is the cable entry point and cabling work and location of the CPE, we are asking the customer if any furniture or any items belong to them is necessary to move. We are requesting customer to do it to reduce our installation teams less contact with the their goods. Then after the installation, our installer is cleaning all the CPs with the disinfected the materials like the wet tissues. Then never allow to sit on the sofa or on the chair. And there will be no contact during the handover as well. We are not touching the customer computer, TVs, or remote controls. So all the handover, we will explain by the talking only. Then customer doesn't need to sign any form or anything like before. Before that, customer was digitally signing their acceptance on the tablet to accept the work and confirm everything in order. But after the pandemic start, our installer is signing on behalf of the customer. We are taking photo together with the customer, but with the safe distance with them to show the tablet to confirm order is done and customer accept. But in case if customer needs sign any paper like the customer health declaration, we are asking customer to use their own pen, not to share with the installer to minimize the contact with them. Then maybe it may be the request we will discuss with the service provider. When during the customer appointment call, we may request the customer to let the air out of the premise to let the fresh air to go in before installation start or installer arrive, or after the installation done. This is the contactless installation, the steps. Let's watch the video. I believe the video is good to explain all this contactless installation. And later during the question and answer session, the person in charge for our customer premise connection and who prepared this video will join me, Mr. Akmal, to answer some question if there is. Okay, Rıza, we can play the video.
Yes, thank you, Guven, for the nice presentation. So we will just see a short video clip by Guven's team that how the whole process is done. Sorry, I think I was on mute. So thanks for the nice presentation and video clip, Guven and Guven's team. So the Q&A for this session will be performed at the ending part as well. And let's move to our next speaker, who is Michael Finch from CRU. He will give a broad overview on the current fiber optics market and some forecast numbers. So please welcome Michael.
Thanks, Musafi. Having some audio issues there, just to check you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you properly.
Yeah, we can hear.
Excellent, good to hear. Thank you.
So Michael, the control is with you. I think you can start.
Excellent, Musafi. I'm just going to skip back, thank you. Skip back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good stuff. Well, thank you very much, Musafi, for organising this. You always appreciate working with the FTTH Council, in particular APAC, and CRU will continue to do so. We've had a good long-standing relationship, so thank you for that. Guven, a really excellent presentation and video as well. Very much enjoyed. So morning, afternoon, everybody. Just a quick note, much like Musafi and Guven, just to say I hope you're keeping well and safe during these troubling times. Just going to outline my presentation quickly. Before I do, I just want to pause on this slide about CRU. Now, I expect there are some subscribers to CRU services online. So if you are, a very warm welcome to you. You might be familiar with just a few of the slides of content today. But I just wanted to say, for those that aren't familiar, CRU, we are a research consultancy, and we specialize in commodities, and that does branch out as far as wire and cable, and of course fiber optics, which is where my expertise lie, and a big focus of the wire and cable team at CRU. Now, our main sort of focus is on actually the cables themselves, so the fiber and cables that we particularly focus on in terms of supply, demand, and pricing. We don't particularly get involved in components and sort of network equipment, but we still obviously keep track of that market. As I mentioned, we have been supporting the FTTH Council for some time now, and we look forward to our close collaboration in the future. Much of what I present today will be drawn quite heavily on two of our key services, our fiber optic monitor, which is a short-term report which covers near-term developments and pricing, as well as our market outlook, telecom cables market outlook, which looks at our 5-year forecast for supply and demand for preform fiber and cable. Now, in order to sort of protect or sort of hide some of the more sensitive information, some of the data from the charts has been sort of redacted or is missing. That is on purpose. Obviously, we need to protect our subscribers' investment into CRU services. But if anyone is interested in seeing some of the underlying data behind these charts that isn't a subscriber, by all means, feel free to reach out to myself personally, and we'll work something out there. So with that, I'll move on quickly to the presentation outline. So when Musafi asked me to give the talk today, I really wanted just to provide a bit of backdrop to the coronavirus, the COVID-19 outbreak, how that has impacted the fiber optic supply and also demand as well. So that's what we're looking at today. We're going to focus in on China. It's a bit of a case study for certain instances in, say, in supply, but also how they have sort of got over the curve and looking to recover and the future for that market there. We're going to compare the APAC region as a whole to some other key regions, North America and Europe as well, from a demand perspective. And I just wanted to finish on some silver linings. Maybe we can take some positives out of the current situation moving forwards, and let's take a view to look ahead rather than back. So with that, I will jump ahead then to look at the impact of COVID-19. Again, this sort of upfront section is going to focus mostly on supply. So before I get started, just want to run through the bullet points on the left there. So as of, I believe, yesterday around midday, the World Health Organization confirmed there has been over 5.5 million confirmed cases of coronavirus. Now, it has had widespread effects on pretty much all countries of the world. Economies pretty much everywhere are suffering and under great, enormous pressure. We've seen GDP forecasts, IP forecasts decreasing, debt increasing, and it has been particularly tough for a number of industries. Automotive has been particularly hard hit, consumer durables, obviously the leisure and travel industry. Now, the telecoms as a sector, as an industry, of course, is not exempt from a pandemic. We can clearly see that. However, it has proven to be more resilient than some, of course, and it has done in the past in terms of its resiliency through harsh economic times. The lockdown, of course, that we have seen imposed in many different countries across the world has had quite a notable impact on supply. Mostly thinking about China and India here with factory closures, although the greater impact pretty much has been on demand, and we'll look at that later on in the presentation. Just a reason sort of why we do expect or we have seen such an impact to demand. There's a stat there for you. China Mobile, China Telecom and China Unicom combined have over 850,000 employees. Now, getting everyone where they need to be during a period of lockdown, or even after the lockdown has lifted, getting people and workers back from rural China into the urban areas in the city centres and where they need to be in terms of cable deployments has proven to be very difficult. And it is a long and slow process, especially when there are restrictions still in place in terms of level of activity and travel as well. When we look at the carrier perspective, of course, there has also been significant financial pressures. Now, most carriers across the world are sort of staying firm and saying that the COVID-19 outbreak won't have a large detrimental effect to their underlying figures for the financial year 2020, which is good to hear. However, they are under increasing pressure, losing revenues from, let's say, roaming charges, also increased costs from allowing greater flexibility in payment plans and increasing data usage at no cost for customers during this difficult time. It's a great move from carriers, but of course it does come with some financial burdens. The chart on the right hand side then, so those familiar with CRU services, this is taken from our telecoms market outlook report. So in around mid-February, I fixed the numbers for global optical cable demand. We can see the view for 2020 at that time in dark blue was a decrease of -1.9, so a small contraction in the market we were expecting. So we're already looking at a relatively weak year for the global optical cable market. Some of that weakness had, of course, at that time, we were aware of the situation in China in terms of the outbreak. It was quite centralized to Wuhan just at that time then. So it didn't really bake into that forecast the full global pandemic, which it proved to be. We were perhaps too optimistic in terms of the spread of the virus. So the May update numbers you see there does take into account the full impact of the coronavirus outbreak and the subsequent lockdowns and decrease in cable deployments that we have seen worldwide. So we're now expecting in the region of 3.6% decline or market contraction in terms of global optical cable demand. That's our latest cut of numbers. Subscribers will get an update very shortly on that. If we look at 2020 then, of course, we are expecting a pickup. We should be aware that part of that is due to base effect, those high growth rates we're looking at next year, following 2 years of relatively weak demand in the market. So next slide. So I want to run through China as a case study in terms of looking at their supply, what the impacts of coronavirus was. I've got 5 bullet points on the left there. I'm going to step through them and some charts to help sort of explain what I'm talking about really. But if we look at China as a country as a whole, obviously we started to see the impact of the coronavirus outbreak very late December throughout January. And then we came into the Chinese New Year period. It was at that point when the central government decided to introduce certain measures, lockdowns and closures to try and contain the virus. These were very restrictive, very heavy-handed, but as we'll come to later, proved to be quite effective. Now, of course, this has had some impact on preform fiber production and cable production throughout the country. We saw closures in all provinces, whether it be temporarily or looking at reduced capacity, split shifts. But also we need to bear in mind the prolonged closures that we saw in Hubei and particularly Wuhan. Of course, this was at the epicenter of the virus and the outbreak. And the closures there lasted for much longer. So overall, Q1 fiber and cable production, CRU estimate to be down around 27 and 18% year-on-year respectively for both fiber and cable there. So quite a notable drop, a really big drop in output, more so on the fiber side. We'll come to that in a second, but effectively the reason we're seeing more of a drop in fiber output is because we believe there has been some destocking on the bare fiber side taking place over Q1. So if we take a look at the chart on the top right hand side there, it's CRU's estimate for bare fiber inventory as of end 2019. Now we estimated in the region of 24 million fiber kilometers that were kept in inventory above normal levels at producers or cablers across China. This is equivalent to around about the size of the Indian market in 2019. So a very notable size of inventory there. But we believe that sort of portion that circled off there, around 5 million, was perhaps drawn down in Q1 in China. There are some differences between certain provinces and individual companies. For example, I believe YOFC had a slight increase in their stock levels, but overall, as a country, we believe there was some destocking on the bare fiber side. So cabling some of that fiber, but of course not producing more fiber, fresh fiber. So from Q2 then, moving to bullet point 3, we obviously heard that normality returned to the market. So we started to see producers outside of Hubei come back online in March, measures easing in other provinces. And of course, late March, we saw Wuhan itself and facilities there come back online and begin to operate at normal or pre-COVID levels from around about early April, which is very good to see. So our view then, CRU's view, is that the lost output that we experienced, that we've talked about there, the decline in fiber and cable production, can be recovered, can be clawed back throughout the remainder of the year. As we know, the facilities in China are heavily underutilized currently, operating well below their max utilization levels. So there is scope for them to get some of that lost production back throughout the remainder of the year. Whether or not it will play out is a different matter. There's a number of reasons why that may not happen. I want to point out there will be some provincial differences that will exist in terms of production as well. That moves us on to the chart at the very bottom there. So that's CRU's view on year-on-year change in bare fiber production in 2020. And we can see sort of that left column in terms of Hubei fiber production, significantly in terms of output, contracting more in 2020 on a year-on-year basis compared to the rest of China, which is only looking at around 13% contraction. In China as a total, we're looking at a 14% contraction in bare fiber production. Now that might seem, really quite significant, a huge drop in output, but that is purely based on the view that we will see continued destock. So there is a risk to that forecast, certainly. If stock levels don't continue to decrease and we see stock drawdown throughout the remainder of the year, that view will change. I want to draw your attention to the few sort of text in that chart there under China summary. Our view for cable demand, optical cable demand in China as a whole, is down 6% in 2020. That tracks or tends to track very closely to the view on cable production. So we're looking at -5% for China. Like I said, typically they're quite closely correlated historically. It does vary by ±1–2% depending on the change in net exports, of course. But then we look at obviously that view for bare fiber production in China, and that is down by let's just call it double digits this year we expect, and that of course means further destocking throughout the market. We can see how that plays out over the course of 2020 and 2021 if we take a look at the bottom right hand chart. So historically CRU's very closely kept fiber production, cable production in line. That's our estimate of the market and the feedback that we have received. So until we saw great changes in the market come sort of late 2018, where we started to see a bit of stock build in the market, historically we've tended to call the markets relatively balanced in terms of bare fiber and cable. But like I said, we did see some of that stock build throughout late 2018 and into 2019. And we can see that highlighted in that sort of blue circle, the divergence between the two lines above 2019 there. If we look at 2020, we can see that the situation is opposite. We're seeing a bigger contraction in bare fiber production as that continuous stock drawdown on the bare fiber side continues. and less on the cable production side. So we're looking to get back towards a balanced market. It's not all going to be achieved this year, but it will be a big boost for prices if that can play out. Lastly, on point 5 there, producers we believe will continue to be very active in the market. So this view on sort of bare fibre production is liable to change. They will look to seek export volumes wherever possible, of course, keep utilisation levels as healthy as possible. But this will be increasingly tough this year to find significant volumes outside of China. As we'll see in a few slides' time, it's looking like the rest of the world outside China is a little bit weaker than perhaps it has been in the past. So how has supply been impacted outside of China? In general, roughly we can see a drop in Q1 across all major regions, except for the US. Q2 in general is looking very weak, or particularly weak in Europe, India, and Latin America. So the lockdowns here started a little bit later, of course, in China, and much of sort of the weakness in the closures, especially in India, of course, extended well throughout April and into May, as we know now. I want to make the point here that I'm talking about these declines in production and output, but they're very little in the grand scheme of things when we look at full 2020 volumes, considering what it potentially could have been. Now, this is important, and it's because of the measures such as that the Guvens talked about today that have been put in place by producers. So in terms of mitigating risk, looking at contingency planning, looking at split shifts, separating employees, social distancing, making PPE equipment available. It's for all these good reasons that the producers have taken, which has allowed the supply chains to hold firm. And this is all the way throughout the supply chain, so right from raw materials all the way through to, if we're looking at from the demand side, active network equipment, base station construction, all the way through. So it's a really strong effort from the entire industry that they have worked together and worked hard to keep the industry running. Demand, however, has been slightly harder hit, and we'll look at that over the course of the next few slides. So this is going to focus mostly on cable demand. I want to start with our view for global. So we've seen obviously the total view for 2020. I showed that earlier, but I want to break this down onto a quarterly level now. So we can see Q1 2020 then, unfortunately, with CRU's estimating the market contracted in the region of 12 to 13% year on year. And again, that is for global optical cable demand, which correlates very closely directly to cable deployments. Whereas in previous years we've seen slight differences in China versus ex-China, China being perhaps a source of weakness last year, whereas ex-China sort of supporting high growth rates. In Q1 we definitely saw a unified contraction in the market. Pretty much all major regions were experiencing some form of weakness, and for that reason we've seen Q1 cable demand slip below the 100 million fibre kilometre level, unfortunately, and one of the lowest we've seen in recent years. If we look specifically at that China, world ex-China view, we can see a huge sort of proportion or percentage of that decline, that weakness in Q1 can be attributed to China. Now, naturally, like I said, we did see very strict lockdown measures imposed throughout the majority of Q1. And of course, this massively impacted cable deployments. I mentioned China Mobile, Telecom and Unicom. It simply wasn't possible for them to continue to deploy at the same rates and levels they were experiencing in late 2019, for example. So we did see some connectivity plans be pushed out, be delayed. We've of course all heard about some of the small scale 5G programs which had to be pushed back or delayed in direct response to COVID-19. So there's no surprise there that we saw a big contraction in Chinese demand in Q1. The world ex-China view then, like I said, is important to note. So we haven't seen this level of decrease or contraction on a quarterly basis for some time now. And that is largely due to some of the weakness in other markets, which we'll touch on in a second. Now, Chinese share of world cable demand, that pop-out chart in the top right, is just worth bearing in mind. It slipped well below the 50% level, just to 44% in Q1. So playing a much smaller impact in sort of the global world scale. It kind of gives you a gauge to how much that market suffered in Q1 and contracted. Now, it's important here that we bear in mind sort of the outlook for the remainder of 2020. Of course, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. The outlook for China, particularly, is a lot brighter, especially from Q2 onwards. It is looking very good in China. We'll touch on that in a second. Unfortunately, Q2 as a whole, so looking at April, May and June for much of APAC. Europe and Latin America, CRU estimate to be pretty weak. So continuing on from that weakness experienced in Q1. Again, most of those regions were behind the curve in terms of lockdown measures imposed. So it's only natural that we see a sort of prolonged period of weakness for those countries. And of course, the measures were less strict, and we are seeing a slower return to normality than in China. So I want to talk about China now, using it again as perhaps a bit of a case study, look at its path to recovery. So what does the rest of the 2020 look like? So firstly, in the bullet point on the left, if we run through them, and most importantly, there was very swift virus containment. This came from the very strict lockdown measures that were imposed. It did prove to be very successful and has allowed the entire industry, telecoms, but beyond that, in terms of other industries and the economy as a whole, to get back to some form of normality, at least from sort of around about mid-April, from May, certainly from Q2 onwards. Also in response to sort of the economic weakness that the market has experienced, we have seen some notable stimulus measures imposed in China. Now, these have been infrastructure related, but a big portion of that has been dedicated to 5G, data centers, edge computing, cloud computing, which is a big boost to CRU's view for Chinese demand. And it has, as we'll look at in a slide's time, led to some upgrades. This chart here shows the view on CapEx spending for China's 3 major carriers. Now, most of these plans for CapEx spending were put in place before these stimulus measures were announced. But what we do or start to understand is some of these sort of spending figures will now be supported and part of that stimulus package, which allows easier access to finance and faster, perhaps, impact in terms of cable deployments and 5G sort of network build-outs as well. So we can see here the big change if we're looking at effectively blue, which is non-5G, versus yellow, which is 5G related CapEx. We've seen a 338% increase in what the 3 carriers are dedicating towards 5G network construction this year. So a huge jump in terms of 5G dedicated capital spending by the 3 main carriers. This is especially important when we consider how little or the declining sort of impact of demand that FTTX is having in China. Is sort of Roland would typically present at sort of the meetings. We have seen, you know, China has a very high level of penetration. So F5 to the home or 5 to the X is no longer having such an impact on demand, and that sector is contracting sharply. So it is, of course, down to 5G now to really support the view for cable demand in China. And we believe a huge shift in 5G spending, a shift to standalone network architecture will be very supportive of fiber demand throughout 2020, but moving into 2021 particularly. A brief line there at the bottom, network sharing arrangements. So most recently between China Mobile and China Broadcasting Network does pose a slight downside risk to that. It can be a little bit detrimental to fiber demand as we see less network overbuild and competition between carriers. So like I said, the full view then for China, if we look at the yellow line, is 5.7% contraction, 5 to 6% contraction in optical cable demand in China. Now, this doesn't particularly seem positive, but I want to point out that this has come from a -9% estimate that CRU had in February. So we are seeing some upgrades in that market and signs of optimism growing, especially for late 2020 and 2021. So moving on then to look at the view for APAC. So this is CRU's sort of typical chart that we show. We've got key countries broken out from the APAC region. If we look at the yellow line, which is year-on-year growth for the region as a whole, and this again is excluding China, we saw a 10% contraction in 2019. The majority of that can be related to weakness in India. We all know the situation there, but it is 2020. Whilst you can argue the view's improving, the market contraction for 2020 is looking at around about -5%. We have seen a unified contraction in most of those markets, as opposed to 2019, when it was particularly just India causing the weakness. So for all key markets, of course, we're looking at a 3 million fiber kilometer drop in cable deployments in India this year, but also some weakness creeping into markets in Japan, Korea, Indonesia and Thailand, as of course coronavirus does impact those markets, has impacted those markets. The more mature and the markets of Japan and South Korea, which typically had very good virus containment, are slightly better market outlook. So looking perhaps at flat to only down very low single digits this year. But the region as a whole is looking at a 5-6% contraction. If I move through then to look at how does that compare against the rest of the world, two key regions here, North America and Europe. So North America, I'll start with first, is amongst our fastest growing regions. Now I mentioned cable production actually grew in Q1 in North America, and that's because cable demand was particularly strong in Q1, which bucked the trend that we saw in Q4 2019. Now America was, particularly the US, was a little bit behind the curve in terms of when they imposed lockdown measures, but as a whole the industry has been very well protected, and we have seen positive signs come out from carriers such as Verizon looking at increasing CapEx expenditure. Whilst our view for Q2 is slightly weaker than Q1, we do expect the year as a whole to experience growth in terms of cable installations in the US. We do see some pullback in Mexico, however the US as a whole making up around 85% of that market. We do expect North America to grow marginally, and again it's one of our strongest regions this year. In terms of Europe then, the situation is a little bit different. So we saw a big contraction in Q1 across markets, especially in Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, particularly hard hit by coronavirus, where cable deployment plans were completely put on hold in some cases and delayed. France was particularly weak in Q1, and we expect the market as a whole to slowly recover after Q2 being a little bit weak, but the market as a whole, we're looking at around a 4% contraction in cable deployments this year. So a couple of key comments. We have seen some drawdown of inventory, which is a positive. We've seen a drop in import levels, particularly from China. Of course, that's in line much with the drop in demand, but also it does pose a chance for domestic producers to regain some of that market share moving forwards. The COVID response has been a little bit slow across Europe as a whole, and we do expect it to have a longer lasting impact to our view. 5G is at risk of delays across Europe, and that also rings true to APAC. So we've seen a number of spectrum auctions being delayed and 5G plans being delayed, so pushing back our view for 5G related demand further into the future. It's important to bear in mind, yes, 2019 was particularly weak. 2020 is again unfortunately looking to be a pretty weak year, again impacted by coronavirus, but it is important to remember the midterm sort of growth prospects. So this is our compound annual growth rate view for 2019 to 2024. The global total as a whole in the region of 5 to 6%. But looking at sort of our APAC and China region, they are amongst the fastest growing, 6 and 5.6% respectively. And India, just want to pull that out separately, 2 very weak years, but we are positive for the remainder of the 2020s. We do expect huge scope for growth there in that market. So looking at a much higher CAGR. So it is important to remember that. Now, very briefly, I think this one is my last slide of content. So just want to run through the silver linings of the market. So there's 5 key points I've put there. So it has been a tough year. Rasafi said it at the start of the call, but there are some things that we can take out of this, some lessons learned, and looking forward, some positives. So the recent lockdowns has brought internet access very much under the spotlight. For example, in India, poor access to a huge swath of the population, many people not being able to get suitable access, and perhaps too much a reliance on wireless. In the US, we've seen a big highlight. It's highlighted the digital divide massively. And again, we've seen some CapEx increases to look to offset that. Number 2, telecoms is proven to be essential. We all know this, the big shift to working from home. It has now, I think, raised the importance in certain governments to be in line with sort of water, gas, electricity. It is essential in today's living. We've had a structural shift in the way we work. CRU has moved to full-time working from home for the foreseeable future, and it's proven to be absolutely fine, no drop in productivity. I think this is going to change the way we work moving forwards, many different offices. And of course, this is going to put pressure on on governments, on industry bodies to make sure those networks are prepared for this shift in working. So greater focus and a need to future-proof fixed line networks is essential. We of course saw the data surge during lockdowns. Networks as a whole responded well, but we do need to perhaps look at our fixed line over the coming years. So we do expect some more ambitious FTTH targets near term, buoying our view for fibre demand. And lastly, yes, we will see some delays in 5G, but over sort of the near term, we believe that have just a little impact. If we've seen in China, very early stage 5G network construction isn't actually that fiber intensive or has proven to be just yet. So we do expect some of that 5G related demand to be a little bit delayed over a longer period, which will smooth the growth profile. But on the upside, like I said, more ambitious FTTH targets near term will look to offset that somewhat. So that's my last slide. I just wanted to highlight the fact again that we, of course, report on our fiber optic for our two main services, our Fiber Monitor and Market Outlook. There's a snippet for the telecom cables Market Outlook there. Much of what I presented was taken from that. So if that is of interest, anyone wants to get more information on that, please feel free to drop me an email or a phone call and get in touch. And with that, Rasafi, I'll hand back to you. Just thank you very much for listening, guys.
Thanks, Michael. It was such an insightful presentation, and
let's see.
it will help our members and attendees to strategize their future targets and achievements. So thanks to everyone. So we will next move to our Q&A session. So all the attendees we have currently around 90 attendees with us. I think if you would like to ask any specific questions to any speakers, please let us know. You will find a tab in the control panel of the GoToWebinar, and you can just ask there if you have any questions. So I think we have got some of the questions here. Okay, first one for Guven's team. It's from Sufyan Sulaiman. He has asked that during the MCO, how much cost is increased or reduced for the new installation flow, including the contactless installation in customer premises?
Okay, Mr. Sufyan, I believe from Telecom Malaysia, all good for the friend, and I have to answer this one carefully. Telecom is also the customer. He's asking the cost, right? Cost increase for us as a contractor.
Yes.
Okay, definitely there is a cost increase because there is the PPE we have to use. But the PPE cost is not that much. When you calculate the one mask, hand sanitizer, glove, everything. But the main cost increase in our OPEX. Because during the lockdown, we almost work with only less than 5% of the capacity. When the cost is continued, like the maintain the people, their salaries, everything. And after the MCO, the turn into the CMCO, conditional movement control orders, which allow us to start the work. I believe currently we haven't reached our 100% capacity yet. That one is increased our cost. Akmal, can I say easily during this couple of months, our cost increase is I think during the MCO is 100% cost increase because no income, but expenses continue. Then when we start under the CMCO, almost 50% cost increase for us. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that answers the first question. So the second question is from Arka Mukherjee to Guven again. The question is, how are you managing the increased cost, reduced profit or increased price to service provider?
Say again?
How you are managing the increased cost of your operation, reduced profit, or I think there is reduced profit chance, or the increased price. Are you charging extra to the service provider?
Based on our contract, signed contract and commitment, we cannot change the price. But I believe the customer also is trying to help us, especially on the PPE cost. We really need to say thanks to them. But the operational cost, I believe we cannot charge to the customer. We cannot change the price unless the service provider is willing to help us more.
Okay. Okay. So the two questions I had for Guven so far.
Okay.
And I have another questions. Let's move to Michael. So I have got a couple of questions for Michael. But first of all, one attendee named Nilesh Pandey actually wanted to know some definitions for CM, CU, and CT. If you'd like to explain before I go.
Yeah, quick one, of course. Apologies, I was trying to squeeze it on the slide, but that is the three major carriers in China. So China Mobile, China Telecom, and China Unicom.
Okay, thanks. So the next questions from our Vice President Rajkumar Mathai. He has asked that any delay of 5G implementation expected due to the pandemic situation.
Firstly, hi Raj, hope you're doing well. Yeah, so we do expect some delays. It very much depends on the country, effectively, and sort of the policies. But as you know, and as I was talking about in China, we're not really expecting any delays to 5G. We did perhaps see some slow base station construction, of course, over the lockdown period. But again, as with many things in China, it seems like it's very easy for them to offset sort of any lost productivity and regain that in the latter half of the year. So we don't expect 5G to be delayed in China, especially with sort of the big shift in 5G related capex. In the US, for example, maybe a slightly similar view to China. It is a huge priority there in terms of the 5G race, if you want to call it that. We've heard anecdotal evidence about being, over the lockdown period, getting sign-off for, let's say, cell tower construction, rights of way, permit access. It's been more difficult to achieve in the US, and of course, from that we have seen slight delays in some sort of 5G related activity, network construction build out, but in general it's been relatively small, and we do expect 5G to be on track in the US. Where we've seen the most sort of delays in terms of the 5G chain from initial conception to network sort of build out has been on the spectrum auction side. So in various countries, I can't remember them all off the top of my head now, but certainly across Europe we've seen delays to spectrum auctions. India, it's looking likely again that will be delayed and pushed back likely. So we do expect the allocation of spectrum to be one of sort of the major pinch points and holdups in terms of sort of initial rollout plans, and that the delays there are directly attributed to coronavirus. So yeah, it depends on the country really, but in general, in quite a few countries, yes, we do expect a delay to their plans.
Thank you, Michael. So I have got another question from Raj again. He has asked that when will China Mobile start their fiber cable bidding? Do you have any?
Yeah, good question. It's a very difficult one, and unfortunately, as it stands right now, we don't have a set date, of course, as many of us are perhaps hoping for. What I can relay is information I get direct from the market. As you're aware, Raj, we speak throughout the supply chain and have many industry contacts, of course, not just our subscribers, but throughout the entire industry across the globe, and I'm happy to relay the feedback we're getting. It looks like consensus opinion for the China Mobile loose tube tender. Of course, they've released some volumes on ribbon, but the loose tube tender will be delayed, as we know. That should have already happened. But around June, July is sort of the consensus opinion that we're hearing right now. The stimulus measures we do hope will, perhaps bring that forward a little bit. If that didn't happen, we believe it could have been a bit later, but it wasn't a surprise to CRU that we're seeing delays to the tender. They're still very much using up some of the volumes that they tendered for last year. But if I was to pick a date, I would say late June, early July, if I had to.
Okay. So the next question to Michael again from one of our friends named Ankit Singhal from India. He has asked that what was some of your criteria to assess the Indian market's positiveness or growth during 2020 to 2024 period of time?
Yeah, exactly. If I understand the correction, sort of the question, sort of what positive indicators are there for growth, perhaps. So, firstly, hi Ankit as well. I hope you're doing well. Yeah, so apologies if that sort of presentation was a bit gloomy in terms of the outlook for India, but of course there are challenges in that market, huge financial burdens before the coronavirus pandemic. So following the AGR ruling, overhanging debt, very low average revenue per users for services, and effectively it's moving towards almost a monopoly or duopoly in the market, and it's been very tough for some of the carriers there. Of course, coronavirus put a spanner in the works again. It meant that there were further issues, further financing and debt issues relating to that. In terms of the positives in sort of what we're tracking and looking at, firstly on the carrier side is the fact that there has been increased investment in the carriers over the last, let's say, month, 2 months. So we've seen people like Facebook come in looking at Jio in certain circumstances. Bharti Airtel is now looking at perhaps refinancing or freeing up some money at least, which has been positive. So seeing some investment coming into the carriers is definitely a positive sign. Delayed payment schemes that's potentially been imposed, and looking at spectrum allocations, delayed payment schemes to that as well is a positive and will help ease pressure, financial burden on the carriers. A unified lift in or a price level or limit on data as well should be beneficial. Recently they lifted they hiked tariff prices. All major carriers did at once, which is very beneficial. So small things like that which are positive and will sort of help definitely help them late on in 2020 and into sort of the years following. In terms of scope for growth, it is huge in India, as we know, and the penetration rates from an FTTH perspective are very low in India. There is a lot of growth for fixed line and wireless as well, both looking at 4G LTE, not even thinking about 5G for now, but so there is large growth potential in that market. It is just about sorting out the existing issue with carrier debt that will help unlock that potential. So schemes like the BharatNet scheme unfortunately has been delayed a bit during the coronavirus pandemic. So that's been pushed out a little bit, but again, that is a very ambitious scheme, and if they hit targets, it will be a big boost for fiber demand. Thanks, Rasafi.
Thank you, Michael. So again, to you, one of our ex-president of FTTH Council Asia Pacific, Arvind Mishra from India, has asked to you that will COVID-19 push service providers towards more on wireless for 5G than fiber infrastructure?
Good question. I think, again, it's dependent on the country existing network infrastructure, what's currently in place. I mentioned, I think if we were to generalize in CRU's view, currently is very near term. And when I speak near term, I'm looking at 6, maybe 12 months, maybe 18 months, but we're looking at fixed, greater focus on fixed. So looking at increasing the robustness of existing networks, making sure they are ready for that structural shift in the way that we are looking at working. As I mentioned, many offices and looking to go remote, flexible working. So I think there will be a bigger shift on fixed in the near term. And that dependent on country, of course. But then beyond that, I think, no one's going to forget about 5G. It is very much the future. It will unlock a lot of potential when we look at smart industry as well, and we all know the many applications for it. But I think in certain circumstances, especially where we're seeing spectrum delays, and India might be a prime example, I think there'll be a bigger focus on fixed rather than wireless, or the next generation wireless, I should say, over the next 12 months. But of course, 5G is not going away. It's just a case perhaps that gets pushed back a little bit more, you know, which for us and what we're predicting and modeling at CRU is a more steady growth profile relating to 5G, so a longer build-out period than previously expected, which will support growth at a marginally lower level, but for a longer period of time.
Thank you. Again to you. I think I've received a couple of questions regarding India's market, and that's quite of relative to the earlier question as well. One friend of ours from Japan, Shigeru Kawabata, he has asked that, do you see any negativity in the Indian market, because there are some financial problems of BSNL and other telecom carriers in India caused by too low ARPU to earn profit. So what is your answer to that?
Yeah, thanks, Risafi, and thanks for the question. So I think I touched on much of this earlier, but in summary, yeah, it's been a tricky market. So it was only from around about the second half of 2019 that this really started to play out. Sort of the, you know, the carriers in India haven't always, you know, they have been struggling for some time now. The declining average revenues per user, the let's say the race to the bottom in terms of tariff prices sparked by Reliance Jio has been or led to certain weakness in the market. And, you know, that was purposeful from Jio. They knew what they were doing, trying to capture market share. But it does mean carriers like, you know, Vodafone, Bharti Airtel have struggled as a consequence. And then we had the AGR ruling, which meant that, you know, we had billions that needed to be paid back by the carriers. And unfortunately, the two most impacted were the ones perhaps in the most, the weakest financial position. So Airtel and Vodafone Idea, you know, they have got the biggest debt burdens. Jio will sort of had a little bit less to pay back, which is beneficial for them. They're in a stronger financial position as well, cash position. So it is because of this that we are seeing delays to connectivity targets. I mentioned the BharatNet scheme, you know, maybe slightly independent to that, but it's a good indicator of perhaps the weakness in the market, that being extended, deployments no longer hitting the, you know, the high run rates that we perhaps have become accustomed to in 2018 for India. So, you know, originally we were looking at, you know, 30 million being a very good run rate for cable deployments, 30 million fiber kilometers on an annual basis. If we look where we are at currently, CRU estimate that Q1 cable deployments were more like 4 million fiber kilometers in that region. So far from the sort of 7-8 level that we've perhaps become accustomed to. So it is a weak market currently, but as in response to Ankit's question, there are positives and easing measures which should help sort of with that financial pressure that carriers are facing, and sort of, you know, beyond this year, I do believe it will be a tough year, but beyond this year, look to support the market, support the carriers, and get back to some form of normality and higher level of cable deployments on a quarterly basis.
Thank you. So again to you, from our current president, Venkatesan Babu. He has asked that when it might be, when the average price of fiber might come back to the decent price, such as maybe US $8 per kilometer.
Yeah, good question. I'm a pessimist. I don't think we're necessarily going to be getting up to those levels anytime soon, perhaps if not at all. You know, as we know, in China, I heard the other day some stock being offered for G652D below $3 per fiber kilometer. This is exceptionally low levels. You know, we are well below the price floor, the cost floor for production. We simply can't produce, even the most technologically advanced producer with the most efficient process can't produce at below $3 per fiber kilometer. If you can, then I apologize I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of the market. But until we see, the reason being for the weak prices is, of course, we've got declining demand. Yes, that's one issue, but we've got the huge excess in capacity, and of course we've got bare inventory levels. China being a bit of a price setter for the global market. You know, we first saw prices collapse in China, exports rise to the rest of the world as domestic demand weakened, and of course prices falling in all other regions. So China treating that as a price setter, which it is for many commodities. We look at that market specifically. Until we see that bare fiber inventory of around 20 million fiber kilometers now being drawn down and utilized, it's not until that point that we will see any pressure on prices ease. Even when we look beyond that, though, we still have, I can't remember off the top of my head, maybe 25% excess capacity in the market, maybe more, 30%. If we're looking at preform, you know, what's the installed base of preform capacity versus fiber production and actual fiber demand? It's a huge difference in the gap there. And that's coming from 2016, 2017, where we had the shortage, where pretty much all factories were operating at around 95, 100% over that in certain circumstances. But it's because of that spur of investment around then. All these facilities, these preform expansion projects came online 2018, 2019. We're seeing that big change and that gap divide grow, the divide between fiber demand and preform capacity. And it's until that becomes addressed in some, you know, meaningful closures, some permanent closures, mothballing of facilities, I don't expect any easing in pressure, any notable easing in pressure. We may get back up to, of course, you know, $4, you know, next year or late this year or early next year. But, you know, over the next few years, unless we see that gap decrease, it's looking like it's going to be pretty weak for some time.
Thank you. So again to you. The question is from our BOD side, Board of Directors of the FTTH Council Asia Pacific, that is there any COVID-19 influences for import-export logistics? Can you see?
Yeah, good question. So it certainly had an impact in China. Of course, if we're looking at, you know, Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, we did see roadways in and out of the city being closed, rail, seaports, river ports, that they were all temporarily shut for a period of time at least, which did impact, you know, the exports from that specific center, that region. China as a whole, you know, that was replicated to some extent on most of the seaports on the eastern seaboard. There were some delays in shipments, sort of greater processing needs at ports, which delayed shipments somewhat as well. So it has impacted volumes traded beyond what it normally would do. I think exports, surprisingly, actually, exports held up fairly well in China on a cable side. Bare fiber, I think, dropped a little bit more, but not as much as perhaps I was initially expecting. But in general, yes, there has been slight disruptions. Using China as a case study, it's proven to perhaps not be as big as I would initially think or thought of. It does seem like being such a key sort of point for the economy, getting the ports working, getting trade flowing is such a key priority that it's proven to have not as big an impact as initially thought. So, for example, in the US, we've seen little impact, you know, minor delays, sorry, but nothing major.
Okay, the last question I will read. I have received lots of questions, but for time constraint, I cannot read everyone's questions. I'm sorry for that. The last question I will read out from our Malaysian colleagues, Shah Iqbal. This is not that relative to only fiber cables. So does CRU see any growth in hybrid fiber and power cables?
Yeah, in short, yes, we do. We think it's going to be quite an active area of the market. Sort of when we're looking at network architectures, of course, there's various options we can deploy, but perhaps a decentralized sort of architecture will be supportive of this. We believe, especially with 5G and the necessity for, you know, the huge amount of small cells and microcells that we are predicting, and we have seen or start to be deployed at least. You know, a lot of these will need power, of course. They can't necessarily have the space for, you know, the generation facilities at site or huge connection to the grid on site. So it is down to remote powering. We believe is an important concept. And of course, that can only be delivered through, you know, these hybrid cables. So on sort of the flip side, the second arm of our business at CRU, the wire and cable team, we look at metallic insulated wire and cable. So this is also feeding into that view. Then, if we are having perhaps an increase in these hybrid cables, you know, with conductor being contained within them, that's feeding into that view for demand as well. But yeah, we do believe it is a growth area, perhaps, in remote powering being the driving force behind that.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to Michael and Guven. So I think anyone from the attendees, if you have any specific questions, the Michael Finch and Guven Togan's email I can provide to you. You can ask them questions via email. So thanks everyone for attending our first webinar, Fiber Talk webinar, organized by FTTH Council Asia Pacific. Thanks to our honorable speakers. Thanks for your time. Thanks to all of the attendees. We had about 90 attendees out of 140 registrants. Those who need the slides and presentation materials will be delivered to you next week. And we will have our continuous effort to bring out more webinars in the coming days. Our next webinar will be next month, end of next month, which will be specifically on our FTTH APAC Panorama, FTTH or building fiber, the Asia Pacific overview. So the date will be announced soon to everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar and will connect in future again. Thanks to everyone. If you have any specific feedback to us, please let us know. We will try to improve. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to the speakers, Michael and Guven. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.